All right, so now that we've added Firebase admin to our backend, the next thing that I want to do is set up our backend with the concept of ownership, right? So as we add multiple users to our application, it's going to become important that we know what notes belong to what users, right? We wouldn't want user 1 over here creating some notes and having user 2 come along and being able to access those notes, right? Unless, of course, user 1 has shared those notes with them, and that's something we'll get to later on. So in order to do this, right, we already saw the basics of doing things like this with our friend tracker app, but essentially what we need to do is add some extra properties to our data in the database to signify what notes belong to who. Now, there are several ways to go about this, and choosing the best way isn't a super straightforward task. So to show you what I mean, let me explain two of the main ways that I might go about doing something like this. The first way would be to have each of our notes, right, in addition to having an ID property, a title property, and a content property, we could also add a property that said, owner ID or something like that. And that would contain an ID that would tell it what user was the owner of this note. Okay, so in other words, what user created this note. Now, that's one way of doing it, and that's the way that we used in the friend tracker application. But let's think of some other ways that we could make this work as well. Another way to do this would be, instead of having a notes collection in our MongoDB, to instead have a users collection. And inside of there, we could simply have data for each of our users, right? We'd have email, we might have name, we might have, interests, etc. And additionally, we could also have a property that says notes, okay? And essentially what this would contain, well, there's actually several different things it could contain. One of those things might be just the IDs of the notes that the user has created. Okay, so in that case, we might have note 1, 2, 3, 4. We might have note 2, 3, 4, 5. We might have note A, B, C, D, right? And essentially what we would have to do in that case is whenever the user wanted to load their notes, we would first load that user's information from MongoDB, probably by using the user's ID, of course. Then we would take a look at their notes property, and what we would do is we would take each of these IDs and load the corresponding note for that ID from the database, from the notes collection. Okay? So that's one way we could do it. The other way we could do it is by actually storing all of the notes themselves directly inside this property, right? So we could say, instead of having just the IDs, we would actually have the information for each note. So we could say ID, blah, blah, blah. We could say title, blah, blah, blah. We could have content, blah, blah, blah. And we wouldn't even need to have this owner ID thing because we know who it belongs to because it's just on their user object in the database, right? And of course, this could go on for as many notes that they have, and that would work as well. Okay? So already we have several different possibilities for how to store our data in the database. And this is where you can start going down a rabbit hole of, should I do this? Should I do that? What's the best way of doing this? What's the best way of doing that? And while most of those questions have fairly certain answers to them, at the point we're at in our application, we don't need to spend a whole lot of time worrying about, will this way work? Will this way work? Because all of the ways will work. The only thing we have to be aware of is that it's going to significantly change the logic that we end up writing on our front end and back end, and it could potentially affect our architecture as well. Now, another thing that I want to point out too is that in MongoDB, what we generally end up doing when we're faced with several different situations like this is doing a combination of several of these, okay? Now, in order to kind of illuminate what I mean by that, let's take a look at this first situation here where each of our notes just has an owner ID property, and that's basically just the ID of the user that created this note, right? Let's say that in our application, I don't know, a few weeks in the future, maybe a few months in the future, we end up wanting to display the name of the user, or maybe the email of the user that owns a note, underneath the title of the note. So if a note was something like my thoughts, right? Underneath that, we would end up displaying that john@gmail.com created that note. Now, if we had structured our data like this, that would be a little bit of a pain to implement, right? Because essentially, the endpoint that we would be loading this data from would have to first load the notes for the user. And then for each of those notes, that endpoint would have to go through and replace this owner ID property with an actual owner property that would contain things like the email of the owner, etc., right? Whatever data we ended up needing on the front end. Now, that's of course not the end of the world, and it's definitely a possibility, but it does add some extra work on the part of our backend. So in that case, what we might want to do, right, one thing that would make this easier anyway, is instead of just storing the owner ID in the backend in the first place, what if we just stored all of the data for the owner on the note instead, right? So this would be just an owner property in the database, and that property would contain an email, it would contain the name, it would contain the interests, basically everything that we would have over here in the user's database. All right, and that would make this situation very easy. However, one situation that it would make significantly harder is, let's say that a user wants to change their email, right? What used to be a pretty simple thing, we would literally just say something like db.collectionusers.update1 and then update the email property. What used to be a fairly simple thing is now made much more complicated by the fact that this email is duplicated across the database for each of the notes that the user has created, and really any other kind of resource that the user has created as well, if we continue this method of doing things into other resources, such as if the user is able to create things like blog posts, right, articles, etc. Okay, so that's kind of the trade-off that we eventually run into many times when dealing with databases in our application, and that's kind of why I wanted to talk about this here, to let you know that there's not really a straightforward answer, right? Generally, you'll find that what makes one task easier, right, what might make something like this easier, makes something else on the other side of our application, like changing the user's email, a lot harder. Okay, so really it comes down to those trade-offs. Now, just to give you a reverse example of this, let's take a look at the example here that I mentioned of how to store the notes that a user owns. Okay? So either of these ways would make the task of displaying all of the notes that a user owns fairly simple, right? Let's imagine that on our front end, we want to say, we want to say my notes. And in fact, this is what we do want to do. And then underneath that, we want to display all of the titles for the user's notes. Okay, so my thoughts part 2, right? Something like that. Whatever people write notes about these days. If we were to store our notes like this, right, just having all of the information for that note inside an array on the user's collection, that would make that super simple, right? All we would have to do is when the user first logs onto the app, we load all of their information from this collection here. We can immediately display all of their notes and any other resources that they've created, okay? If we were to instead do this way that we have here, by just storing the IDs of the notes, that would be a little bit more complicated, but we could still work it so that this notes property comes back populated to the user when they log on to our application. All right, now in this case, I'm going to argue that this way of doing things, right, just storing the IDs, is better for one very simple reason. And for that very simple reason, I'm going to actually delete all of my drawings here and give myself a little more room. Let's redraw the case that I was talking about. Let's say that we have a users collection here, and that each of those users has a bunch of properties, and they also have a notes property which contains, let's say that it contains the actual data of the notes, right? So the ID, the title, the content, etc. Thinking ahead, if we were to use this strategy to store all of the notes on our user's collection, we would run into a very interesting problem, similar to the problem I mentioned before of storing the actual user's data on each of the notes. And that is, at some point in this app, since it is a note-sharing app after all, we're going to want our database to contain a record of what notes have been shared with whom. Okay, so let's say that in addition to having this notes array, which is the notes that a user has created, a user also has a property called shared notes. Oops, let me try and spell that correctly there. Shared notes. And what this is an array of all of the notes that another user has created and shared with this user, right? So it'll contain very similar information to what we saw up here in the notes that a user created. It'll have the ID of the note, it'll have the title of the note, it'll have the content of the note, etc. And that would make it very easy to display a list that says something like shared with me, right? And then it would just display all of the titles of the notes that were shared with the user underneath it, just by saying something like shared notes.map and mapping each of those notes to the title. We could say something like, we could display the actual titles of the notes in this section very, very easily without having to populate those notes at all. Now, the problem with that strategy, and again, the reason I'm going through all of this is because I see people do this a lot. Let's say a user makes a change to a note, right? That was fairly simple, as we saw when we wanted to create our update endpoint. All we had to do was say, notesdb dot update one, and we could just say, we want to update the note with an ID. We want to update the title property and the content property, let's say. Well, if we were to have this extra shared notes property that contained duplicated information in every user that note had been shared with, this suddenly becomes a lot more complicated, right? Because we need to actually find each of those properties inside each of the users that the note has been shared with and modify. Let's say that the content property has been modified. We would need to modify that in each and every shared notes property of each and every user that note had been shared with. So anyway, the point of all of this is that it's not necessarily a straightforward process when we're deciding how to store our data in MongoDB. So what we're going to end up doing really is just kind of picking one of these ways and following that to the end and seeing what kind of problems we run into and if we have to end up changing that in some way. That's generally just how we have to go about developing when we're working with databases like this. So anyway, what we're going to do here is we're going to open up a Mongo shell and we're going to modify our data in our MongoDB a little bit to represent ownership. Now, the way we're going to choose is the way that, to me at least, at the moment, seems the most promising, and that's going to be to simply add a notes property to each of our users, okay, which contains the IDs of the notes that user has created, right, 4, 5, 6, etc. And we're going to have a separate notes collection that will actually contain the notes with those corresponding IDs. All right, so note 1, 2, 3 will be this one here. Note 4, 5, 6 will be this one here, and so on. You get the point. And that will allow us to quickly and easily update notes even once those notes are shared with other users. Right, so if we add a shared notes property, which also contains those IDs, right? Something like, let's say 789. We'll be able to find that 789 note in our notes collection and use that there. Okay, so that's going to be our basic strategy. What we're going to do is open up our Mongo shell. We're going to go to the database we created. So we're going to say use notes app db. And we should be able to say show collections and just make sure we're in the right database. We should see the notes collection. And what we're going to do is create a users collection that will basically contain information about the user as well as what notes they own. So what we're going to do for that, we're going to say db.users.insert1, and we're going to insert an object into our Mongo database, right? A document that is, that matches the user that we just created in here, john@gmail.com, and we're actually going to delete john2@gmail.com. We'll just say delete. And in order to link this up, you might remember we just need to copy the user ID that was randomly generated by Firebase auth, and we're going to add that to our user document inside MongoDB, and we'll use that to actually find that user in the database when that user makes a request. So for this, we're going to say db.users.insert1. We're going to add an extra ID here called auth ID, and we're going to paste that ID that we just copied into there. Additionally, we're going to give this user the email that they had, so we'll say email john@gmail.com, and we're going to say notes, and we're going to say that they own one of those notes. Now, to find an actual ID of a note that they might own, what you can do is just open up a new shell. So we'll say Mongo here, and what we're going to do is say use notes app db, and then we'll say db.notes.find, and then we'll say .pretty to make sure they're printed out in a way that we can read it. And let's just copy the ID of one of these notes. Okay, so we'll say my first note belongs to this user, and we're going to go back to our other terminal and paste that ID. Oops, hang on a minute here. Whoa, something's going wrong. All right, I'm going to have to retype this. There we go. Let's try that again. We're going to say Mongo, and then we're going to say use notes app db. We're going to say db.users.insert1. We're going to insert a user with the ID from Firebase auth. Okay, sometimes the terminal gets messed up a little bit, so you have to redo this. Nothing to be frustrated about. We're going to say email john@gmail.com. And we're going to go back to our other terminal, copy this ID again, and we'll say notes. We're going to paste that first ID into here. Okay, we'll do the second one as well, I suppose. We might as well get that. So we'll copy this note ID here. We're going to go back here, paste that there. And that will be the user's notes. So we can close off the closing curly brace there, and we should be able to hit enter and see acknowledge true, inserted ID, object ID. And now we can find that user if we want to by saying db.users.find.pretty, and we'll see that user's information printed out in a nice readable way. Okay, so we see that our user has an ID property, which refers to their ID in the auth provider we're using. We have the user's email, and actually this here is an example of duplicating information because this email is already available from Firebase auth, but we're storing it in our own database because that makes it easier for us to access. Okay, and lastly we have the IDs of the notes that this user has created inside this notes array. And that's going to be the basic structure for all of the user objects we create. So I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.